Okay, world, better hang on to your hat. You're about to meet the original web-swinging wonder.
Spider-Man needs very little introduction. He is by far the most famous Marvel superhero created by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. Ever since his debut in Amazing Fantasy in 1962, he has grown into a major cultural icon, and there have been countless different versions of the character, as evident if you're familiar with the Spider-Verse series or the most recent Marvel Cinematic movie, Spider-Man: No Way Home. However, the one that most people tend to overlook also happens to be the earliest screen adaptation of the character, the original Spider-Man cartoon series from 1967. While some might remember the classic theme song or the hilarious internet memes, the show has more or less fallen under the radar. So today, I think it's time that we finally sat down and took a closer look at this retro cartoon series and some of the many talented people who helped create it. And trust me, there is a lot to talk about, so let's get started.
Shivering shadows. There's a whopper.
Back in the 1960s, color television was still considered the next big thing, and studios were looking for any possible way to capitalize on its popularity with consumers. Enter Grant Ray Lawrence Animation, a Canadian animation studio founded by Grant Simmons, Ray Patterson, and Robert L. Lawrence. Lawrence was a producer for a handful of independent movies and TV shows, and I am deeply sorry that I wasn't able to find a photo of him. Meanwhile, Simmons and Patterson were both experienced animators, having previously worked on a number of Disney films such as Dumbo and Fantasia. After forming their own company, the trio immediately began to struggle with finding investors. They tried pitching a number of different animated pilots for potential TV shows. Most of them were extremely low budget and very few of them were very successful. However, their luck seemed like it was starting to change when they were approached by Marvel to make animated TV shows based on some of their comic books. The animation team consisted of many other former Disney animators as well as a handful of newcomers in the industry. Stan Lee was closely involved with the show's writing staff, while the money and distribution was managed by Hollywood producer Steve Kranz, and the final product would be the Marvel Superhero Show. Although it was initially advertised as one show, it was actually multiple shows packed into one, which was common back in those days. There was a Hulk cartoon, an Iron Man cartoon, a Captain America cartoon, a Thor cartoon, and a Prince Namor cartoon.
He's broken the connections!
Don't just stand there, shoot him. Idiots!
As you can see, the animation was very cheap and limited. In fact, most of the animation was created by tracing artwork from the comics, and all they did was animate the lips and the eyes. The animators would even use the comics as storyboards, resulting in many of the episodes being nearly word-for-word adaptations of the comics, which I think made the series way too predictable. Originally, each episode began with a live-action segment where they would have actors dressed up like Marvel characters, talking to the viewers, but these scenes have since been lost and forgotten, with the exception of this one clip of Captain America.
Aye, there's the super action, for in the Marvel Superhero Show of shows, when we blow our minds with glee.
Okay, that was pretty bad. But according to a rumor, the dialogue in the intros was actually written by Jerry Siegel, the co-creator of Superman. These cartoons would air on a variety of different stations, but they struggled to find an audience, and the Marvel Superhero Show would be cancelled after only 3 months on the air. Nonetheless, Marvel and Grant Ray Lawrence pushed onward, and their next show would be bigger and better, and it would be based on the company's most popular comic book series.
Spider-Man does whatever a spider can. Spins a web any size, catches thieves just like flies. Look out, here comes the Spider-Man.
Unlike its predecessor, the Spider-Man animated series for ABC would be successful enough to last for 3 seasons, and we will be talking about all 3 of them. Why all 3? Well, the reason is because the show went through a number of bizarre changes as the years passed.
Where there's a web, there's a way.
Many of the same cast and crew members from before would come back to work on this series, and they seem to learn from a lot of the mistakes that were made with the Marvel superhero show. The animation is far superior. It's still pretty rough, but it's still a major improvement. Stan Lee would work behind the scenes with Spider-Man artist John Romita Sr. as creative consultants for the writers and animators. The story is pretty much the same as it usually is. Peter Parker is a nerdy photographer for the Daily Bugle, but nobody knows that he is actually the masked crime fighter Spider-Man. Each episode during the first season pretty much has the same formula. It would usually begin with some strange villain causing trouble in New York City, and Parker's boss J. Jonah Jameson would send him to take pictures. But that's when he becomes Spider-Man and saves the day. But it usually ends with him getting lectured by Jameson for one reason or another and admired by his co-worker Betty Brant.
Betty, I was just wondering, what are you doing?
Well, don't stop now. Go on.
Miss Brent? At last. Thanks to a new weapon, Spider-Man will soon be no more. Spider-Man has had it.
But the production for each episode had to be done as fast and cheaply as possible to meet deadlines, and the animation department worked around this any way that they could. For starters, Spider-Man's design was simplified to make the animators' jobs easier. One of the first things you'll notice is that the webbed pattern on his costume only appears on his mask, his hands, and his feet. They would also reuse a lot of animation, and would often make mistakes. Sometimes the logo on Spider-Man's costume would only have 6 legs, and since they repeated animation so often, this mistake would be repeated time and time again. And if the episode was ever too short and they needed to pad out the runtime, they would just show recycled footage of Spider-Man swinging around and hopping on buildings over and over and over and over and over again. To most people this might seem lazy, but you have to remember, back in those days, children's cartoons were made on shoestring budgets, and it was very common for shows to keep reusing the same animation. We also need to talk about the art style. Many of the characters have these highly realistic designs, but then you have all these other characters who are a lot more stylized and cartoonish looking. And personally, I think the art style works here because it gives you a different impression of each of the characters, and that makes it feel more like a comic book.
Greet the day like a blade of grass. Sing with the eyes, man, but dig the mower. Then the
Old spider sense isn't tingling for nothing.
Spider-Man is voiced by Paul Soles, and I've got to admit, it is definitely one of the most unique Spider-Man voices because he disguises his voice. When he's Peter Parker, he tries to make it sound more high-pitched, but when he's Spider-Man, he deepens his vocals to sound more mature and valiant.
I'm on my way, Mr. Jameson. Just let me know when you're ready to apologize.
The rest of the voice cast also do a pretty fine job. Peg Dixon gets to show off her voice range by voicing basically every female character on the show, including Betty Brant and Aunt May.
This is Peter's Aunt May speaking. He's in bed with a bad cold. There, you see? So you'll just have to find someone else.
Paul Kliegman's voice for J. Jonah Jameson is also interesting. His performance is sort of the opposite of J.K. Simmons. Instead of barking all his lines, he just growls.
At last, that web-headed weasel is going to be exposed for the fraud he is.
And of course, many famous Spider-Man villains would appear from episode to episode. Dr. Octopus, Green Goblin, the Scorpion, Sandman, Electro, the Lizard, Rhino, Vulture, Kingpin, and Mysterio. But some of them are quite different from how they were in the comics. The show's version of the Green Goblin is closer to Stan Lee's unused concept for the character. Instead of being a man in a costume who drank a serum that drove him crazy, this Green Goblin is supposed to be an actual goblin that was created from witchcraft. Norman Osborn does not exist in the show, so it's pretty strange.
These will make short work of you! You fool! You destroy us all!
The Lizard in this version is also a little different because TV censors thought a guy missing an arm would have been too dark for a children's cartoon. Unfortunately, because of the low budget, the showrunners had some very complicated problems with licensing many of the characters from Marvel Comics. Both Kraven and Chameleon were supposed to appear in the show, but for the reasons that I just explained, their roles were replaced by 2 new villains. Chameleon was replaced with a celebrity impersonator called Cameo, who disguises as Spider-Man to frame him for robberies. Meanwhile, Kraven the Hunter was replaced with Crocodile Dundee.
Hope you don't
The animators were even able to save money by creating an invisible villain called Noah Body who breaks Spider-Man's other foes out of prison and they band together to beat him, or at least they try. And then there's this one guy called the Phantom who has the ability to create living shadow puppets to commit robberies. I actually do appreciate some of these original villains because it made each episode feel fresh, so Spider-Man's not just fighting the same villains over and over. They would also utilize lesser known powers from the earlier comics like Spider-Man's ability to create a web shield, a web parachute, a web trampoline, a web umbrella, a web key, a web slingshot, a web drill, and a web motorboat? Many of the episodes are adaptations of the comics, but the writers also did a pretty good job at giving the show its own identity without ever allowing it to become too predictable. There's an episode called Sub-Zero for Spidey that revolves around these ice monsters from Pluto which begin freezing the city into ice. But with the help of a scientist called Dr. Smarter, Spider-Man soon discovers that the Plutonians were just confused and stranded on Earth, so he decides to help them return to their homeworld. The episode One-Eyed Idol was actually banned from television for its depiction of racial stereotypes, and after watching it, I can agree, the depiction of the African tribesmen is very over the line.
Oh, my spider sense.
Okay, I have to admit that was pretty funny. Nonetheless, it's clear why they chose to remove it from television. In the episode Night of the Villains, an evil wax sculptor called Parafino creates living wax sculptures of famous historical criminals and uses them to commit robberies. In another episode, he captures Spider-Man and Betty Brant and tries to dip them in wax and put him on display in his wax museum. So, the first season might be dated in a lot of ways, but it still had a nice mix of action, comedy, and cartoon violence to keep children entertained. The show seemed like it was doing fairly well with viewers, but unfortunately, this was not enough to save Grant Ray Lawrence Animation from filing for bankruptcy. Supposedly, there was a lot of animosity between Steve Kranz and the three showrunners over how much they were paid for their work. This would be the final nail in the coffin, leading the studio to shut its doors after the first season had ended.
It's either a crazy psychedelic dream, or there's only one other possible answer.
When the show was renewed for a second season, all future episodes would be animated in-house by Kranz's very own studio, and the budget for each episode would now be cut in half. With Grant Ray Lawrence no longer in business, the showrunners were no longer available to continue the series. Stan Lee and John Romita also stepped down from working on the show to pursue other projects for Marvel. From this point onward, the continuation of the show would be taken over by animation director Ralph Bakshi. Although he was unknown at the time, Bakshi would later make a name for himself directing animated films aimed towards mature audiences. Many of them revolved around real-life issues such as drug abuse, racism, and the bloodshed of war. But before all of this, one of his first big jobs as an animation director was working on the second and third seasons of the Spider-Man cartoon series, and it would definitely foreshadow his later work. The reason I say all this is because once Bakshi took over production, the show suddenly took a shocking dark turn. The first change you'll notice is in the backgrounds. New York City starts to look less like a Saturday morning cartoon and more like a watercolor painting of the wrong side of town. Many of the backgrounds are full of dark colors, and other times there's not even a background, it's just a montage of cryptic psychedelic paintings. And since they were now only working with half the show's original budget, they started doubling down on recycling animation, over and over, and you get the idea at this point. And they would even go as far as to borrow footage from one of Grant Ray Lawrence's previous cartoon series, Rocket Robin Hood, a futuristic retelling of the old Robin Hood legend. So keep in mind, if you ever notice an episode where Spider-Man travels into space or fights aliens, then it's more than likely reusing animation from Rocket Robin Hood. But what's most bizarre is that Season 2 is actually supposed to be a prequel to the first season, because it starts off with Peter Parker in college. He doesn't work at the Daily Bugle yet. In fact, Bakshi spends the first episode of the second season telling the origin of Spider-Man. This would be the first time Spider-Man's backstory would be told outside of the comics. We even get Uncle Ben's tragic death, and up until this point, the censors were pretty strict when it came to killing off characters, but with Season 2, I guess they just didn't care.
What happened?
Brace yourself, son. I have bad news. Your Uncle Ben has been shot. murdered.
Uncle Ben, dead? No, it can't be.
It was a burglar who your uncle surprised.
It might not have the same impact as the live-action movies, but it still does its job, and most of all, Spider-Man learns a very powerful lesson when he catches the man who killed his uncle, and I think it hammers home the message pretty well.
That face, oh no, it can't be. But it is. The fugitive who ran past me the other day. The one I didn't stop when I had the chance. If I only had tackled him when I had the chance. But I didn't, so he escaped, and now Uncle Ben is dead. Yes, Uncle Ben is dead, and in a sense it's really I who killed him. Because I didn't realize in time that with great power there must also always be great responsibility.
The next episode takes the prequel concept another step further by showing Peter get hired at the Daily Bugle to help support Aunt May.
I told you, Miss Brandt, that I don't want to be interrupted. Oh, the kid whose uncle was murdered. Well, why didn't you say so? Send him in. No, wait. Tell him he's hired. And get him started right away. And that's my good deed for today.
However, because of the ongoing budget cuts, licensing characters from Marvel Comics became far more difficult, which meant we would see far less of Jameson and Brandt from this point onward. This also meant that a lot of Spider-Man's villains would disappear from the show entirely, so the writers would have to come up with even more original villains, such as aliens, mad scientists, wizards, mole people, a giant cat monster, a giant flower monster, a cowboy with a laser gun, and a pagan god from outer space? What's even more bizarre is that most of these new villains have one thing in common. Have you noticed it yet? Most of them have green skin for some unknown reason, and it's never even acknowledged. At first, I thought it was because they were recycled villains from Rocket Robin Hood and maybe they were supposed to be aliens or something. And I was half right, some of them were recycled, but it turns out most of them were original. Well, that's because there's actually another explanation. It turns out that it used to be a common trope for cartoonish villains to have green skin. If you're familiar with The Wizard of Oz, then you know what I'm talking about. It just so happens that the show utilized the trope more than usual, so much so that it just draws a lot of attention to itself and it only adds to the show's weirdness. Spider-Man would also fight all these giant, otherworldly monsters, and these are usually the best parts.
Only one chance.
In the episode Blotto, a failed movie director brings one of the monsters from his movies to life with the help of a mad scientist. The monster is pretty much a ripoff of the Blob, a living pile of ink that devours everything it touches. Many fans have speculated that Blotto was actually the inspiration for Venom. However, this has never been officially confirmed. But then again, it could be true.
Yikes! Wow, almost lost my head.
A lot of these later episodes would also begin to show more of Peter Parker's personal life, going to college, trying out for sports, and meeting girls. It seemed like in almost every episode he had a different girlfriend, and it usually ended with him either getting dumped or rejected.
You have to stay with your Aunt May? But your Aunt May is out of town. Peter, don't tell me about your Aunt May. It's another girl.
No, it's not. Listen. Hello? Hello? Oh, how do I get into these things?
In one episode simply titled Home, Peter is sitting by himself at a dance club feeling lonely until he meets a young lady named Carol and the two connect instantly. But he's in for quite a shock when he finds out that she also has spider powers.
Hey, you can't do that. I'm the only one with...
I'm sorry, Spider-Man.
After a couple of chase scenes, it is revealed that she was actually from an alien planet where everybody has spider powers. The plot is basically recycled from the Plutonians episode, but with its own unique twists. The spider people are stuck on Earth living in a futuristic underground city. They're trying to return to their planet, but there's this weird science experiment going on that involves this drilling device that could destroy their hideout. So Spider-Man decides to help them by disabling the device so that Carol and the rest of the spider people can return home. In another strange episode, Cold Storage, Spider-Man wanders into the middle of a jewel heist and gets knocked out. The crooks lock him into a freezer before escaping with the jewels, leaving Spider-Man to be frozen in ice. Eventually, the ice melts away and he is revived, but when he steps out of the freezer, he is surprised to find that he has woken up in a post-apocalyptic future. New York City is reduced to rubble, people have devolved into savage cavemen, and there are all these prehistoric creatures running around like dinosaurs and woolly mammoths. He keeps trying to get away, but everywhere he goes, there's always something else trying to kill him, and just to make matters worse, he starts having a panic attack. Then suddenly, it's revealed that it was all a dream. An Iceman shows up and helps unfreeze Spider-Man, who immediately heads off to look for the jewel thieves, and he gives them a good taste of their own medicine.
I've got to hand it to you, Spider-Man. They sure were a pair of slippery characters. How did you handle it?
I don't know. I guess you could say I just kept my cool.
Season 2 might have had a lot of shortcomings, but its psychedelic weirdness gave the show a unique presence, and it definitely delved into some much more dark yet sophisticated ideas for episodes. You would think that after 2 seasons on television, the show would be in good hands at this point, but sadly, this was not the case.
I have a sneaking suspicion that somebody down here doesn't like me.
After the end of the second season, the show would be put on hiatus for a whole year until it was finally greenlit for more episodes. The bad news is, believe it or not, the producers cut the budget in half again. The writers and animators found themselves being rushed to complete each episode on time, and they came very close to missing a lot of their deadlines. Some of the animation was never finished, resulting in a ton of glaring mistakes, and some of the new animation is very, very choppy. Some episodes were made up almost entirely out of stock footage from the last 2 seasons, with only the most minor of changes. To make matters more difficult, the show was pulled from ABC. From now on, the Spider-Man series would only be broadcasted on, well, any station that was interested in leasing the show. This decision would only cause the series to decline even further. On the plus side, they did spend some of their money to get permission to bring back characters like Betty, Jameson, and the classic villains, but most of their appearances are made up of stock footage. And I guess for some reason they weren't able to use Mysterio's likeness because when he comes back, he's not in his costume. Instead, he looks like, oh my god! Yes, that's supposed to be Mysterio. This green-skinned, red-headed hipster with goofy glasses, a turtleneck sweater, a unibrow, a Jay Leno chin, and a cigarette holder. This has got to be the most absurd redesign I've ever seen.
The time has come to show myself.
Mysterio!
Stand aside, I've no time to waste on nobody.
Up to this point, I did not think Mary Jane was going to be in the show, but what do you know, there she is, making her only appearance in this one episode.
Hey, PDO, why don't you drop in tonight? I dig watching me dance.
Whoa, look at her go. The episode Revolt in the Fifth Dimension was considered so scary that it never aired on television. On a faraway planet, a race of small, intelligent aliens have collected information against an evil overlord from another dimension called Infinita. He destroys the planet, but one of the aliens escapes to Earth and his ship just miraculously lands where Spider-Man happens to be. Before the alien dies, he gives him a device that has the secrets of Infinita's dimension. Spider-Man attempts to give the information to the authorities, but that is when he is attacked by the strange invader who teleports him to his dimension, which I could only describe as a bad acid trip.
Nice place to visit, but...
Silence. You have not crossed the threshold yet. Observe.
Climb the stairway of mystery, then cross the threshold of reality, and enter into the realm of Dementia 5.
As you could probably guess, this episode was also made from stock footage of Rocket Robin Hood. Just out of curiosity, I went and checked out that show as well. It's pretty freaky, but this brings the Spider-Man series to a whole other chaotic level. So there were still some other interesting episodes, but this was when the show's limited budget really began to reveal itself. The series finale, Trip to Tomorrow, is literally a clip show of previous episodes. Spider-Man winds up on a train cart where he meets a young runaway with the voice of Rudolph.
I'm running away.
Oh, I see.
You're Spider-Man, ain't you?
That's right.
You think I could become a real crime fighter like you?
Sure you could. It's easy.
He uses reverse psychology to convince the boy to return home, telling him stories of his previous adventures. The flashback scenes are of course made from stock footage of older episodes, and sadly, this is where the series ends. After the studio went bankrupt, Robert Lawrence left show business and quietly disappeared into obscurity. Grant Simmons tragically passed away on October 31st, 1970, just a few years after completing his work on the first season. Ray Patterson would go on to work for Hanna-Barbera on a number of famous cartoons such as The Jetsons and The Super Friends, but he passed away on December 30th, 2001, just 1 month after his 90th birthday. Steve Kranz would continue to work with Ralph Bakshi on a number of animated projects. However, Kranz began to develop a negative reputation as a shyster for ripping off people that he owed money to, including Bakshi, which resulted in an ugly feud between the two of them before they severed their ties. Kranz began to shift his focus towards live-action movies and TV shows. At one point, he even attempted to produce his own Spider-Man movie. Not much is known about the project, aside from the plot having something to do with Spider-Man fighting giant robots built by Nazis. Did I also mention it was going to be a musical comedy? However, the project was considered too expensive, so it never got made, and Kranz would retire a couple decades later. Oddly enough, there eventually was a Spider-Man Broadway musical, but he had nothing to do with it. Ralph Bakshi would move on with his film career, and he would even go on to direct the very first film adaptation of The Lord of the Rings. He eventually retired from animation and became a painter. And of course, the people over at Marvel moved on to bigger and better things.
I think I just created a work of art.
There were some other Spider-Man shows over the next few decades, but none of them ever really had the same impact. The original animated series has also had a troubled release history. Some episodes were included as bonuses on VHS tapes for the 90s Spider-Man cartoon, and there used to be a DVD box set containing all the episodes, but it's out of print. As of this recording, it is one of the only Spider-Man series not to be released on Disney+, and I find that surprising considering the show has remained in pop culture for so long. In the second issue of the Spider-Verse team-up comics, they actually travel to the universe of the 60s cartoon and team up with the Spider-Man from the show. It even features that invisible bad guy. And if you watch the Enter the Spider-Verse movie, there is a post-credits scene where Miguel O'Hara, the Spider-Man of Tomorrow, also travels back to the 60s cartoon, but they don't exactly team up.
How dare you point at me? You were pointing first. Rude to point.
You're being very rude.
In 1989, there was actually a fan-made movie titled Viva Spider-Man, which borrows its plot from an episode of the 60s cartoon, and it actually goes out of its way to recreate entire scenes from the show word for word. Usually, I have no interest in fan films, but this was actually a pleasant surprise. What's interesting is that years later, the director, James Krieg, would actually be hired as a writer for the 90s Spider-Man cartoon. The show's iconic theme song is one of the things that people remember most about the series. It plays during the end credits of the first Spider-Man movie, and an orchestrated version of it plays at the beginning of Homecoming. The punk rock band The Ramones once did a cover of the song for the tribute album Saturday Morning Cartoon's Greatest Hits, and they even had a music video featuring clips from the cartoon.
Spider-Man, Spider-Man, does whatever a spider can. Spins a web in his eyes, catches thieves just like flies. Yeah, here comes the Spider-Man.
So it is pleasing to know that the original animated series is still remembered and acknowledged as a major player in Spider-Man's history. The first season is very flawed, but at least it's entertaining. The second season is like a fever dream, but at least it's creative. And the third season is when things really got out of control. It's sad to think that the people who made the cartoon never really saw a lot of money out of it. But if they were all still around, I think they would all be proud to see how the franchise has grown. The cast and crew were fully aware of what they were making. They knew it was cheesy, they knew it was absurd, and they fully embraced it. And whenever they had shortcomings, they found ways to work around them up until the very end, and somehow it worked. With all that, I can definitely say that the 60s Spider-Man cartoon is a unique blend of being both campy and clever, and it just goes to truly highlight how much Spider-Man has evolved as a cultural icon.
Hey Spidey, isn't Marvel's new Pizzazz magazine fantastic?
Fantastic, but not perfect.
But Pizzazz has the lowdown on Jaws too, and more Sean Cassidy picks than his mother. It's sensational.
Sensational, but not perfect.
How about Pizzazz's Goofy Guide to TV? It's wild look at sci-fi movies. It's games, puzzles, comics. What could be more perfect?
Me on the cover, not the Hulk.
Pizzazz, the almost perfect new monthly from the off-the-wall gang at Marvel Comics.